Who will make the Falcons 53-man roster, and will it include both Michael Penix and Taylor Heinicke?
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn to get started. So, guys, if you don't know me, I'm your very humble host, Aaron Freeman. Been covering the Falcons for many years, formerly at FalcFans.com, RIP. Still going strong in this illustrious podcast. You may also know me as Sirius Black, as Mr. Drew, as the Jolly Green Giant, as the iron that sharpens the iron, and also as Mr. AKA. And of course, I appreciate each and every one of you that is an everydayer of this podcast that makes it your first listen or first watch each and every day. And all you got to do to become an everydayer is to subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So today's episode, we'll be breaking down the Falcons 53-man roster now that mini camp is over and the Falcons won't be practicing until we get to July. And so it's time to sort of look ahead to what this roster may wind up looking like. And we'll go through the offense first, and then we'll turn our attention to the defense. And for me, I have 24 players making it on the offense, 3 quarterbacks, Kirk Cousins, Taylor Heinicke, Michael Penix, 3 running backs, Bijan Robinson, Tyler Algier, and Jason McClellan, 6 receivers in Drake London, Darnell Mooney, Rondell Moore, Kadero Hodge, Ray McLeod, and Casey Washington, 3 tight ends in Kyle Pitts, Charlie Warner, and Ross Dwelly, 9 offensive linemen, Jake Matthews, Matthew Bergeron, Drew Dahlman, Chris Lindstrom, Caleb McGarry, Storm Norton, Javon Gwynn, Ryan Newsel, and John LeGlue as the 9th offensive lineman. And I think when you look at the offense as a whole, there's not a whole lot of competition, at least for the starting spots. There's maybe some depth roles that guys are competing for, especially on the offensive line and tight end. We'll circle back to that later, but I don't think there's really much competition for the skill positions. I think we're going to know, at least at the main skill positions, who are those guys are going to be. You know, I think the biggest intrigue on the offense is going to be sort of which 3 quarterbacks the Falcons keep on the team. Right? You know, do they keep all 3 on the 53-man roster? Do they keep 2 on the 53-man roster and 1 on the practice squad? Because now the 3rd emergency quarterback rules have changed. Like last year, to take advantage of that 3rd emergency quarterback, which is basically the rule that allows that you can have a 3rd quarterback not as part of your 48-man active game day roster that teams have. In the event of an injury to both of your 2 starters, that 3rd guy can basically be inactive and then still play on that Sunday. But in order to make that rule work last year, you had to carry that guy in your 53-man roster. That's why the Falcons carried Logan Woodside on the roster last year. This year, the league changed the rules, and so now you can elevate that player from the practice squad and still be that guy. And so will the Falcons take advantage of that? And, you know, I would argue, you know, Parker Hesse agenda is strong. If the Falcons had been able, if that rule had been in place last year, the Falcons could have kept Logan Woodside on the practice squad and kept Parker Hesse on the roster, and maybe their season would have went differently. But, you know, I tend to think that the Falcons will this year continue to carry all 3 quarterbacks on the roster, right? I think Heinicke and Penix will both make the team. I think many are assuming that Heinicke won't stick because of the Falcons drafting Penix, which I think makes sense. But I think everything the Falcons seem to be suggesting suggests, for a variety of reasons, that moving on from Taylor Heinicke is not as likely as I think some people think it is. Again, it's a possibility. It's definitely a possibility. But I don't think it's as likely or a sure thing as maybe some people are assuming it is at this point in time, right? Because I think one of those reasons is moving from Taylor Heinicke doesn't really save a ton of cap space, whether you cut or trade him. You're only saving about $1.2 million in cap space. That's basically enough to afford 1 veteran minimum signing, which, again, is not nothing, but isn't necessarily really moving the needle from a cap standpoint. I also don't think the Falcons are in as big a rush as maybe some vocal fans are to get Michael Penix on the field as soon as possible. So I don't think the Falcons are against the idea of having Michael Penix basically function as that 3rd quarterback for this entire season and be inactive every single week, right? And basically using 2024 as a redshirt season. I think the other factor is like they probably want to placate Kirk's ego to a certain extent, and they don't want him looking over his shoulder and looking at Michael Penix, and he'd rather see that more friendlier face of Taylor Heinicke. You know, Heinicke's better prepared as a veteran quarterback to take the mental reps that a backup quarterback is going to have to take, because we know in practice, quarterbacks, if you're not the starter, you're not really getting any reps in practice during the week outside of scout team stuff. We've already heard Kirk comment many times when he's spoken to the media over the last couple of weeks since the draft of how valuable having Taylor Heinicke, someone with his experience in the room. Essentially, Taylor Heinicke is performing the Matt Schaub role that Matt Ryan used to have back in the day, as his sort of veteran backup that can be that kind of sounding board, that extra sort of set of eyes in the room. And he's probably better prepared to do that than Michael Penix is at this stage in his career. And we also know Taylor Heinicke has coaches in the building that seemingly are fans of his because they've coached him before. Ken Zampese, their senior offensive coordinator or offensive assistant, was Heinicke's quarterbacks coach in Washington the last 2 or 3 years that he was there. TJ Yates was a teammate of Taylor Heinicke in his last year in Houston and back in 2017. So I think the plan right now is to carry all 3 quarterbacks on the roster. But of course, we know plans can change, and a lot depends on how Heinicke and Penix and John Paddock, the undrafted free agent that no one seems to remember except for when Raheem Morris mentions him whenever somebody asks about the quarterback, how those guys perform in the preseason. And certainly there is a path in the scenario where Penix absolutely lights the world on fire this summer in a preseason and in training camp, and Heinicke's just throwing picks left and right, and that's going to change their plans. And I think in that scenario, I think the Falcons would prefer to trade Taylor Heinicke at the end of August than cut him outright. There may be another team out there that has backup quarterback concerns of their own that is looking for a veteran like Taylor Heinicke that can sort of solve those problems. And I think trading Heinicke would be preferable in that sense, because, again, it's not going to really save you any more money, but at least you're going to get something in return, whether that's a conditional late round draft pick or more than likely it's probably going to be a player for player trade, because that tends to happen quite a bit in August. And we'll see if the Falcons have a position of need where they can, because of Penix's performance and even to a lesser extent John Paddock's performance, they'll feel like, oh, we can now use this to shore up something. But I don't think the Falcons really want to be in a situation where they have Kirk Cousins and 2 rookie quarterbacks behind him. And I don't think the Falcons really want to be in a situation where they're shopping for a new 3rd quarterback at the end of the summer. So I do think Heinicke has I would say like he's probably got like a 65% chance of making the roster. Right? I wouldn't go higher than that, but I wouldn't go significantly lower than that either at this point in time. And so, we've already talked a little bit about, Kirk Cousins potentially not playing really at all during the preseason, given his coming off the injury, given Raheem Morris has spent the last 3 years with the Rams, and Sean McVay and a lot of McVay disciples traditionally, like Kevin O'Connell and Zach Taylor, don't play their starters during the preseason. So I'm expecting we won't see any of Kirk in the preseason, but we'll see if that changes. And I'm expecting the bulk of those preseason reps to go to Michael Penix, so he'll have plenty of opportunities to shine. And that could lead to him outplaying Heinicke, and the Falcons being like, what's the point of keeping Heinicke when, Penix is there and ready? But my expectation for how they'll divvy up the snaps in the preseason is like, in the first 2 preseason games, like Heinicke will start and get the first quarter, Penix will get the second and third quarters, and then maybe we'll see John Paddock in the fourth quarter. And then that 3rd preseason game, we'll probably get, Penix in the first half and Paddock in the second half. And so again, there'll be plenty of opportunities for all 3 of these guys to make their case for, being 2 out of the backups behind Kirk Cousins. Now, elsewhere on the offense, based off my projections, I think the more intriguing battles, again, are at tight end, that 3rd tight end spot, Ross Dwelley versus John Fitzpatrick. Charlie Warner's basically a lock to make the roster because his contract is guaranteed. I gave Dwelley the nod, but I think this summer is going to be a very important summer for John Fitzpatrick because it's essentially his 2nd year, because he sat out his rookie season due to an injury. And so we'll see if he makes some significant year 2 jump, and it's going to really matter for his blocking, right? Because that's really what number 2 and number 3 tight ends roles are going to be, is blocking. I think the backup offensive line is going to be a very intriguing battle. We know who the 5 starters are going to be. We assume Storm Norton and Ryan Newsel will be 2 out of the 3 backups that are active on game day. Who's that 3rd guy? Is it going to be Javon Gwynn, last year's 7th round pick? Is it going to be Kyle Hinton, who was that guy last year? Could be Barry Wesley, could be Tyler Vrabel, Andrew Stuber, John LeGlue, some of the undrafted free agents, right? I think it's a wide open competition. And we'll probably spend a lot more time on this podcast talking about offensive line depth than probably other people will. Other people are going to, let's say hypothetically, Casey Washington, the Falcons' 6th round wide receiver, has a great training camp in preseason, and others are like talking him, but we're probably not going to spend as much time talking about Casey Washington, even if he has a good summer, just because we know like it's probably not going to matter this upcoming season, because basically you are going to need like because he's going to probably be entrenched as the 6th wide receiver. You're going to need like 3 injuries simultaneously at the wide receiver position for him to even see any significant amount of reps on offense. But, someone steps on Chris Lindstrom's ankle wrong, and all of a sudden that backup guard is going to matter. And it mattered last year, right? In those must-win games against Tampa Bay and Carolina late in the season, the Falcons were forced to start several backups. And it's not to blame those backups for the game, but we talked all week long in those matchups, like the Falcons weren't going to be able to rely on their run game against the Bucs and Panthers in those games, and needed to put more on their quarterback's shoulders to sort of carry the offense. And they were kind of make or break games for Desmond Ridder. And unfortunately, they broke Desmond Ridder. And you can make, again, I'm not trying to blame the backup offensive lineman for those losses, but you can make a pretty compelling argument that if the Falcons had more proven or more reliable offensive line depth last year, we wouldn't be talking about Kirk Cousins and Michael Penix on today's episode, right? We'd still be talking about Desmond Ridder because the Falcons could have potentially won that game with better offensive line play behind those guys. So I'm just giving you a heads up. We might get to August and you might hear me talking a lot more about Andrew Stuber and John LeGlue and Javon Gwynn than, some other training camp superstar like Casey Washington, because, we're going to talk about things that actually matter in the season of 2024. Now, maybe Casey Washington balling out this summer is going to matter for 2025, but probably not this year. So, offensive line depth is meaningful. Doing the research, there's a strong correlation between team success and offensive line continuity. We know correlation does not equal causation, but historically, the fewer different sets of starting offensive line units that the Falcons have had, the more wins they had, right? If you look at the last 6 years where the Falcons have missed the playoffs, on average, they've had 4.5 different starting fives throughout those seasons. If you look at their 9 playoff seasons over the last 26 years, they've averaged 2.2 different starting offensive line lineups in those 9 playoff years. So again, correlation is not causation, but offensive line depth matters, right? It's going to potentially impact the outcomes of games because you're going to have injuries at some point. It's like an 88% probability based off of the Falcons' history because they've only had three seasons where the same 5 guys started every game over the last 26 years. So actually that number is a little higher than 88%. But so basically 90%. So, while the starting 11 on offense is pretty set, there is going to be some competition on defense. And that's mainly going to be for the starting spots in the secondary where, there are 2 starting spots up for grabs, I think, at corner and safety. And we'll break down who I have winning those spots and how the rest of the defensive roster stacks up as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. So summertime means baseball, NBA finals, and so much more. And you can bet it all at FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers get $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $200 that you can use to bet on everything from the finals MVP to who's going to hit one out of the park. And of course, you can bet on the upcoming NFL season. Falcons over/under wins of 9.5. Raheem Morris having those Coach of the Year odds. Kirk Cousins MVP odds. How many yards? How many touchdowns Kirk is going to throw for. We got the NBA draft coming up. You can bet on that, who the Hawks are going to take #1. It's all available to you at FanDuel. And you can visit FanDuel.com/lockedon. And you can add another big win to your summer bucket list. FanDuel is America's #1 sportsbook. So before we continue today's Locked On Falcons, I want to let you know about, the worst kept secret in the world, which is the Locked On Sports Today, the free 24/7 sports streaming channel that is programmed for you each and every day to bring you the biggest stories, the can't miss analysis, opinions, and news, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app. Great content over there for Locked On Sports Today. And if you're looking for more local flavor, check out Locked On Sports Atlanta's 24/7 streaming channels on YouTube and the free Amazon Fire TV channels app. It's all part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So, let's talk about the secondary, and then we'll talk about the rest of the defense and special teams at the end of today's episode. But, I have 10 defensive backs making the roster, 6 corners, 4 safeties. The 6 corners are A.J. Terrell, Mike Hughes, D. Alford, Clark Phillips, Antonio Hamilton, and Anthony Johnson. The 4 safeties are Jessie Bates, Richie Grant, DeMarcco Hellams, and Micah Abernathy. And I think we're going to have some real competitions for starting spots in the secondary. Who's going to be the outside corner opposite A.J. Terrell? Who's going to be the starting strong safety opposite Jessie Bates? And I think the 2 prime candidates at outside corner are Mike Hughes and Clark Phillips. The strong safeties are Richie Grant versus DeMarcco Hellams. And we'll talk about the cornerback first. I think most are assuming that it's Clark Phillips' job to lose. It may very well be. I tend to be a contrarian on this issue. I think it's Mike Hughes' job to lose. He's taking the bulk of the first team snaps during the offseason. He's the more quote unquote proven veteran, despite frequent struggles that we saw even last year here in Atlanta as a nickel slot corner. He's generally graded out pretty well as a outside corner throughout his NFL career. He's a better tackler than Clark Phillips, and I think that's going to matter with all the zone defense the Falcons are going to play this year. They're going to give up a lot of underneath catches, so they need guys that can rally to the football and reliably get guys on the ground. And at this point in time, that's Mike Hughes is very proven in that, and Clark Phillips is very unproven in that. But it wouldn't shock me in the slightest if Clark Phillips winds up winning that competition, if he can show, hey, my run support issues are not going to be a liability. That's really the key. And, show that plus coverage ability and his ability to make plays on the ball, which he has done, very well in the college career and, briefly in the second half of last year. So Phillips has the upside in coverage. I think Hughes probably is the more reliable run defender. And obviously I think most people think, the coverage stuff matters more. And I don't disagree with you, but I do think the run support stuff, especially given how the Falcons want to play defensively, is going to matter probably a little bit more than your average fan thinks. So, when it comes to the rest of the cornerback room, where does Kevin King and Antonio Hamilton fit into the mix? Will they be competitors for that starting spot? Maybe. Doesn't look like it right now. I don't currently have Kevin King making the roster. I just don't often see guys, sit out football for 2 years, even if they're injury related in the case of Kevin King, and then, return to become a starter in the NFL, and let alone make an NFL roster, right? So I tend to look at Antonio Hamilton as much safer bet to make the roster. He's got a fully guaranteed 1-year contract, no cap savings if the Falcons cut him. He's a proven performer on special teams. I pencil him in as the gunner opposite to Kadero Hodge on the punt team. And I put Anthony Johnson as the sixth corner. And it's mostly just because, I figured they would carry 6 corners. And just because Jerry Gray, the Falcons DB coach, mentioned him by name a few weeks ago when he was asked about the cornerback competition after they signed him. To me, that was notable to me. But, you could put King and Johnson and Brooks and Harrison Hand and any of the undrafted free agents, names in a hat and pick them out, as my good friend Alan Stirk does for the Falcons Historian Shootout. And your guess would probably be as good as mine. So when we look at the safety position, we mentioned before on the podcast where most of the rhetoric coming out of OTA seems to suggest that it's Richie Grant's job to lose, but I wouldn't be shocked in the slightest if that's reversed and it's Hellams' job to lose. We talked a lot when we drafted DeMarcco Hellams last year in the 7th round of how he's kind of the best fit in a cover 3 safety as that sort of box safety. We expect the Falcons to play a lot of cover 3 under Raheem Morris and new defensive coordinator Jimmy Lake this year. We've talked before about how Richie Grant is probably ideally suited to be a dime safety due to his versatility to play in different roles, being, more capable of playing in the slot and playing some of the deep stuff than necessarily Hellams, who tends to be a little bit more of that one-note box safety. So to me, from that perspective, it totally makes sense for Hellams to be the starter and Grant to be the dime safety, because that would be, quote unquote, their ideal roles. But I think first Hellams has to prove he can be a reliable option and hold up in deep coverage, right? He's been much better playing closer to the line of scrimmage. He struggled as a deep cover guy in college at Alabama. Now, we didn't see those struggles manifest themselves in the last 7 games where he was essentially the starter next to Jessie Bates last year. But you're also going to face better competition at certain points this season, not every week, but most weeks. I think you are yeah, great. You were able to hold up in deep coverage against Gardner Minshew without Michael Pittman in the lineup last year. It's a little different when Patrick Mahomes is coming to town and he's potentially going to be throwing to Xavier Worthy and Hollywood Brown, so like, I'm not going to put, everything like, oh, well, Hellams was fine for 7 games last year. It's like, oh, well, that means he's going to be fine for 17 games this year. We'll see. Again, I think he needs to prove that during the summer. So again, I think in an ideal world, the Falcons would love both Hellams and Phillips, the young guys, to win the starting spots, and because both of those guys are on rookie deals and therefore theoretically can be developed and be potentially long-term solutions at the corner and safety spots. Both Grant and Hughes are free agents after this year, and so if they start and play well enough to keep those starting jobs, maybe they get paid. I don't think the Falcons are against the idea of paying them, but I think in an ideal world they'd love the cheaper option. So we'll see how that goes. I don't expect the Falcons kind of force their hand in this regard, like we often see with young players that they use premium draft picks on. Again, Phillips and Hellams are day 3 picks, so it's not like their first and second round picks that they're going to put their thumbs on the scale, so to speak, to make sure that they win the starting spot. So we'll see how that competition goes. The last safety spot I had going for Micah Abernathy, just because I expect him to be the personal protector on the punt team like he was for the second half of last year. Dan Cruikshank is the other safety that I think is probably his biggest competition in that room, but his special teams experience is almost exclusively as a gunner. And because I expect Hodge and Hamilton to lock down those roles, I don't think there's as much room for Cruikshank to be making the roster. But we'll see. Again, there'll be plenty of competition at all these spots. So we'll see how things shake out in the secondary. Well, the front 7 breakdown is still to come, and we'll talk about how there's, I think, only really one starting spot up for grabs in the front 7, and it's probably not the one that you think of, and we'll break that down to wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. So I have 16 guys making the Falcons roster on their front 7 at D-line, edge, and linebacker. 7 D linemen are Grady Jarrett, David Onyemata, Zach Harrison, Ruka Roro, Brandon Dorlus, LaCale London, and Taquan Graham. The 5 edge rushers I have are Arnold Ebiketie, Lorenzo Carter, Braylon Trice, D'Angelo Malone, and James Smith-Williams. The 4 linebackers I have making are Troy Anderson, Caden Ellis, Nate Landman, and J.D. Bertrand. I don't think there are many starting spots up for grabs in the front 7. I think the one that is definitely an open competition as we enter training camp is the nose tackle spot in the base defense. I think that's a 3-way competition between LaCale London, Eddie Goldman, and Zion Logue. I expect London to win that job. I thought he did a solid job last year when asked to play that role. Basically, when it comes to Eddie Goldman, I'll believe it when I see it in terms of him sticking. We'll see how that goes, and we'll see, what Zion Logue can do, but I think he's probably more of a practice squad guy than necessarily a roster guy. I don't think there's going to be real competition at edge. I think the starters are going to be Arnold Ebiketie and Lorenzo Carter. I don't think there's going to be any competition at inside linebacker. I think the starters are going to be Caden Ellis and Troy Anderson, but it doesn't mean that other guys won't be able to carve out a significant jump of playing time if they play well this summer. There's certainly a world where the Falcons employ all 3 linebackers on the field at the same time this year, in Caden Ellis, Troy Anderson, and Nate Landman, with Ellis sort of moving more to an edge rusher role in those sort of packages. And I don't expect, Carter and Ebiketie to be fixtures on defense. There's certainly opportunities for Trice and James Smith-Williams and or D'Angelo Malone to steal snaps as part of the rotation. And I think the rotation is going to be the key thing to watch how it all plays out this summer, because, when I expect going into the season, I'm sort of expecting the Falcons main foursome in terms of their pass rush. We know they play nickel, 65-75% of the time, right? And they're going to have 4 guys on the field. I think those 4 are probably going to be Arnold Ebiketie, Lorenzo Carter, David Onyemata, and Grady Jarrett. And then Caden Ellis is probably going to be the 5th guy in the mix, in certain packages and whatnot. And so we know that the Falcons, or we don't know, but those are going to be the 4 guys. And then how the rest of the rotation, sort of figures out is going to be interesting. And, what we don't know, but we can make a pretty safe, healthy, educated guess, is that more than likely, in an ideal world, again, injuries and all other variables impact this, but more than likely the Falcons are going to probably have 14 front 7 players on their active 48-man roster each and every Sunday, right? 12 of them I feel pretty comfortable projecting. I just named 5 of them, and Carter, Ebiketie, Jarrett, Onyemata, and Ellis. 3 more are going to be those linebackers, Anderson, Landman, and Bertrand. That leaves 6 spots, right? 3 of those spots I think are going to go to the rookies, and Ruka Roro, Braylon Trice, and Brandon Dorlus. And then Zach Harrison's going to be another one of those spots. And that leaves just 2 more spots for game day, right? One of those should be the winner of the nose tackle competition, but who gets that last spot, right? Is that an edge rusher? Is that D'Angelo Malone? Probably, it's probably going to be an edge rusher. But, is that D'Angelo Malone? Is that James Smith-Williams? Is that Bradley Anae? Is that a second nose tackle, right? There's certainly a world where the Falcons decide to play 2 nose tackles. Is that Eddie Goldman? Is the second guy? Is that Zion Logue or whoever, right? And then where does Taquan Graham and Kentavious Street sort of fit into the mix, right? As you note, I had Graham making it over Kentavious Street, mostly because Graham, I think, has played his best football in a 3-man front that the Falcons are expected to use, while Street has spent the entirety of his career playing in a 4-man front, and I just think that's a better fit for him. So we'll see on that. But, I think some of these guys that may be odd men out, there may be some trade opportunities at the end of training camp if they don't have if the Falcons are like, hey, we can move off of Taquan Graham or Kentavious Street or Eddie Goldman. Good luck getting trade value for Eddie Goldman. But yeah, you never know. So I think those are certainly some options in addition to Taylor Heinicke that we could be talking about some potential trades at the end of training camp. So we'll see how that rotation sort of plays out. I think it'll be an interesting competition to see how it all goes. And it's just really about guys competing to see how big a role you're going to have in a rotation, not necessarily who's going to win starting spots, I think, as far as the front seven is concerned. Of course, we'll wrap with the three special teams players that, going to make the roster: Younghoe Koo, Bradley Pinion, Liam McCullough, to fill out the 53-man roster. No surprises there. I think we'll see Ray McLeod. I didn't have Avery Williams making the roster. And I probably should, now that I sit here and think about it, I probably should have Avery Williams making the roster. So maybe I'll we'll see when we get to Trey Buchanan. But we'll see how it goes. But I expect Ray McLeod to be the kick returner. We'll see what happens with Avery Williams this summer. I think he should be on the team, but we'll see. We'll see. Okay. So that will be a conversation to be had probably again, and we'll revisit that later this summer. We'll probably do another one of these breakdowns before training camp kicks off in mid-July. So, yeah, that's it for today's episode. If you want to tune in tomorrow, I think we'll talk about my draft pick hit rate, right? I had a listener ask me to go back over, a listener basically said, I've only been listening to pods since 2020, so I don't really know how your draft hit rate was before that. So I'd be curious to hear that. And so I think it's worthwhile because, as we got a couple more of these day 3 picks to talk about on the pod, as I finish the film over the next couple of weeks of these rookies. And, I know some people tend to question, some of these projections I have, but I think my record stands up pretty well. So we can revisit it. There's certainly some misses on there. I know Foye Oluokun. We'll probably talk about Grady Jarrett as well. And a couple of Jalen Collins might be a conversation we might have tomorrow. So we'll talk about some hits and misses tomorrow on the pod. Later this week, by the end of the week, we'll get to Brandon Dorless. We'll have some Falcons historian shootouts this week. It'll be me versus Charles McDonald for Michael Turner. And we'll have another matchup that I don't know. It's not going to be Brad Rowland versus Myles Garrett. I do know that we had to reschedule it, but I have to ask Alan again. The schedule is coming up, so I'll let you guys know that I'll have confirmed that by tomorrow when we record that episode about the draft hits and misses. So if you want to tune in to the Falcons historian player shootout, if you don't know what that is a trivia content tournament that we're doing with other Falcon and Falcons adjacent and Atlanta sports-based content creators and writers and all that stuff, bloggers, etc., podcasters, talking about some Falcons legends from the last 20 years. We did 2 last week, work done, and Devontae Freeman. We got another running back this week, and then whoever else is the 4th guy this week that I'm blanking on due to the schedule. But that's all in store for you later this week, along with the draft hit weight and the Brandon Dorless breakdown. That's probably going to come Friday after the Falcons historian shootouts are on Wednesday and Thursday. So that is the plan this week. Again, subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts so that you don't miss a single episode. We're still going strong, guys. I know it's dead time of summer, but we're going to still probably be going 5 days a week from here until training camp. So make sure you tune in to Locked On Falcons as your first listen. Check out Locked On Sports Today, Locked On Sports Atlanta, Locked On Hawks, Locked On Braves, Locked On Bulldogs, all the various shows across the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.